A climber, while ascending in the mountains, notices an abandoned radio station in a place where no buildings should exist. Inside, he finds something that makes him stop and rethink everything, and it will shock both him and you. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The mountain rose out of the range like a severed spine, a vertical wall of stone that caught the wind and broke it apart, scattering it in screaming gusts that tore across the face and vanished into the sky. There were no trails here, no cairns stacked by friendly hands, no scars of pitons or chalked holes to suggest that others had passed this way recently. The rock was raw and indifferent, a place that did not invite visitors and did not forgive mistakes. From the valley floor, it looked almost unreal, a sheer gray plain catching the morning light at an angle that made depth difficult to judge, as if the mountain were less a physical object and more a boundary drawn across the world. At this height, the air was already thin enough to sharpen every breath. Each inhale felt deliberate, measured, something that had to be earned. The cold had a dry, cutting quality, the kind that did not numb immediately, but worked slowly, draining warmth from fingers and forearms until even small movements required conscious effort. Above, the sky was a hard, brittle blue, stripped of clouds by constant wind. Below, the valley lay far out of reach, muted and distant, as though separated by more than altitude alone. The climber moved steadily upward, his body pressed close to the stone, his weight balanced through the soles of his boots and the careful placement of his hands. He climbed alone, by choice rather than necessity, and every movement reflected that decision. There was no partner below to catch a fall, no voice to confirm an anchor or call out a safer line. The silence around him was complete, broken only by the rasp of his breathing and the faint scrape of rubber against rock. He was not young, but he was not worn down either. Years of exposure had carved lines into his face and darkened his skin further, the high-altitude sun leaving its mark season after season. His movements carried the economy of long experience. He did not rush, and he did not hesitate. Each action flowed into the next with quiet precision, the result of countless hours spent on walls where error meant consequence. This ascent was not meant to be dramatic. There was no audience, no summit photo planned, no record to be set. It was a reconnaissance climb, a solitary evaluation of a face that had long resisted easy classification. The maps showed nothing of interest here, only contour lines pressed tightly together, signaling steepness and instability. Satellite imagery revealed little more than shadow and glare, but the mountain had caught his attention months earlier, during a routine review of regional terrain for a separate project. Something about the geometry of the wall had felt wrong, or rather, too precise in one narrow section, as if the stone itself had been interrupted at some point in its long history. He had dismissed the thought at first. Mountains played tricks on the eye, especially from afar. Light, shadow, and distance conspired to suggest patterns that dissolved upon closer inspection. Still, the impression lingered. He found himself returning to that section of the face, tracing it again and again on his screen, comparing images taken years apart. The shape remained, subtle, nearly invisible, but persistent. Now he was here, testing that impression against reality. The first several hundred feet of the climb offered nothing unusual. The rock was fractured limestone and granite, interspersed with bands of darker stone that flaked under pressure. He placed protection sparingly, aware that much of the rock would not hold reliably. Each anchor was tested gently before he committed weight to it, his fingers sensitive to the slightest shift or groan from the stone. When something felt wrong, he backed off without argument and searched for an alternative. The wind intensified as he gained height, funneling along the face and striking him in sudden bursts that threatened to peel him away from the wall. He waited out the strongest gust, pressing himself into shallow depressions, counting seconds until the pressure eased. In those moments, the mountain felt alive, not in any mystical sense, but as a dynamic system constantly in motion, shedding heat, shedding stone, reshaping itself grain by grain. His mind remained focused but not narrow. Years of climbing had taught him that attention had to be wide as well as sharp. He monitored his breathing, the tension in his forearms, the subtle fatigue building in his legs. He kept track of the sun's position, the shifting shadows that hinted at changing conditions. He also watched the rock itself, scanning for anomalies, for anything that did not belong. It was nearly 3 hours into the ascent when he noticed the first irregularity. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker of reflected light, a brief glint that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He froze mid-movement, his left hand locked into a shallow crack, his right foot balanced on a narrow ledge no wider than a thumb. He waited, letting his eyes adjust, his breathing slow. There it was again. The light caught at a precise angle, reflecting not with the dull scatter of mineral, but with the clean, sharp flash of metal. He shifted his head slightly, testing the angle. The glint disappeared. He shifted back. It returned, faint but unmistakable. Metal did not belong here. He scanned the surrounding rock, searching for explanations. Quartz veins could reflect light, but this was different. The reflection was too uniform, too controlled. It came from a narrow vertical seam in the stone, a place where the face broke inward slightly, forming a shallow recess invisible from below. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but heightened awareness. He had learned to respect that sensation. It had guided him away from unstable cornices and toward safer lines more than once. It did not tell him what to think, only that something warranted attention. Reaching that recess would require a deviation from his planned line. It lay several meters to his left, across a section of smooth, slightly overhanging rock with few obvious holds. The move was possible, but it would cost time and energy. More importantly, it would commit him to a traverse that could complicate his descent if conditions deteriorated. He evaluated the situation carefully. The weather remained stable for now, but high-altitude forecasts were never guarantees. His supplies were adequate, but not excessive. He had built his plan around efficiency, not exploration. Still, the presence of metal at this location defied logic. No modern climber would place fixed gear here without leaving a trail of other evidence. There were no bolts visible, no chalk marks, no worn edges where hands had passed repeatedly. If the metal was old, then it represented something far more significant than a forgotten piece of equipment. He checked his watch, gauging how much daylight he could afford to spend. He tested his last anchor, adjusted his rope, and made a decision. The traverse demanded full attention. He shifted his weight carefully, releasing one point of contact at a time, trusting friction and balance more than strength. The rock here was colder, shaded from direct sun, and his fingertips protested as he pressed them against its rough surface. He moved slowly, pausing often to reassess, to ensure that each move left him with options rather than commitments. As he drew closer, the recess resolved into clearer form. It was not a natural crack. The edges were too straight, the interior too uniform. The stone had been worked, cut back deliberately to create a narrow platform just large enough to stand on. He reached it with controlled precision, easing his weight onto the ledge and testing its integrity before fully committing. The stone held firm beneath his boots. He clipped himself in, exhaled, and allowed himself a moment to take in what lay before him. The recess was shallow but distinct, a man-made interruption in the face of the mountain. Set into the back wall, partially obscured by mineral buildup and decades of grime, was a strip of corroded metal. It was bolted directly into the rock, the fastenings thick and square, unlike anything used in modern climbing. He brushed a gloved hand across the surface, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Rust flaked away under his touch, revealing darker metal beneath. The shape suggested a mounting bracket, perhaps part of a larger assembly that had once extended outward. His eyes followed the line of the recess upward and downward. Above, the stone curved slightly inward, offering marginal shelter from the wind. Below, the ledge tapered off, disappearing back into sheer verticality. Whoever had built this had done so intentionally, carving out just enough space to work, to stand, to survive. It was not a temporary installation. It was not accidental. He felt the isolation of the place more acutely now. This wall was not merely difficult to reach. It was deliberately avoided by any rational route. To build something here would have required extraordinary effort, planning, and motivation. He adjusted his stance and leaned closer, scanning the recess for additional details. Faint lines scored the stone around the metal, marks left by tools rather than erosion. They spoke of repeated blows, of patient labor carried out in an environment hostile to human presence. The realization settled slowly, accompanied by a growing sense of gravity. This was not debris. It was not a remnant of a failed climb or a forgotten experiment. It was part of a structure, and if there was one piece of metal here, there were likely more. He straightened slightly, his gaze lifting toward the shaded section of the wall above. The stone darkened there, forming a subtle overhang that concealed whatever lay beyond from view below. The wind diminished in that pocket, replaced by a strange stillness that felt almost unnatural against the constant roar elsewhere on the face. He understood, then, that his climb had shifted in purpose. What had begun as a technical assessment had become an investigation. The mountain was no longer just an obstacle to be negotiated, it was a record, a silent witness to actions carried out long before his arrival. He checked his remaining daylight once more, aware that the choice he made next would shape everything that followed. He could retreat now, mark the coordinates, return with the team, and proper authorization. That would be the safest option, the most defensible. But he also knew how fragile such discoveries could be. Storms, rockfall, and simple neglect could erase traces like these without warning. And there was something else, something harder to articulate but impossible to ignore. Whoever had built this had done so with purpose, under conditions that allowed no margin for error. To walk away now felt like abandoning a conversation that had been waiting decades to be resumed. He shifted his grip, tested the next sequence of holds leading upward into the shadowed section of the wall, and began to climb again. The decision to continue upward altered the rhythm of the climb. Until that moment, every movement had been governed by efficiency and caution, by the silent agreement between climber and mountain that neither would test the other beyond necessity. Now, there was an added layer of intent. The recess with its corroded metal was no longer an anomaly to be noted and left behind. It had become a point of origin, the first clear sign that the wall concealed something deliberately placed and carefully hidden. He moved upward from the narrow ledge with renewed concentration, aware that the rock above differed subtly from what he had climbed so far. The angle steepened slightly, and the surface smoothed into a face that offered fewer natural features. The stone here felt colder under his gloves, shaded from the sun by the shallow overhang that had first drawn his attention. The wind, which moments before had battered him without mercy, weakened as he entered the lee of the wall, its roar dulled to a distant presence. Each move was deliberate. He tested holds that looked solid but proved hollow, retreating without hesitation when the rock flexed under pressure. Protection was scarce, and what little he placed was more psychological than structural. Thin pieces wedged into seams that had never been meant to hold weight. He understood the risk and accepted it, adjusting his pace to preserve strength and clarity. As he gained height, the geometry of the wall began to change in ways that no longer felt accidental. The curvature of the stone bent inward, creating a shallow alcove that broke the plane of the cliff. From below, it would have been invisible, swallowed by shadow and distance. From where he now climbed, it resolved into a distinct feature, one that bore the unmistakable marks of human intervention. The alcove was not large, but it was precise. Its edges were straighter than erosion would allow, its floor flatter than chance could explain. Tool marks scored the surrounding stone, faint but consistent, aligned in patterns that spoke of methodical work rather than geological randomness. This was not a shelter formed by nature, it was a platform carved by intention. He reached it with care, easing onto the stone and distributing his weight slowly. The ledge did not crumble beneath him. It felt dense, compacted, as if reinforced by years of compression rather than weakened by exposure. He clipped himself in again, more out of habit than necessity, and took a moment to steady his breathing. The stillness here was striking. The wind skimmed past the outer edge of the alcove but did not intrude. Sound behaved differently, too, muted and absorbed by the rock. It felt as though he had stepped into a pocket carved not only into the mountain, but out of time itself. He scanned the alcove carefully, letting his eyes adjust to the subdued light. More metal revealed itself, partially embedded in the stone, its surfaces dulled by oxidation and mineral deposits. Thick bolts, square-headed and heavy, anchored plates and brackets that had once supported something larger. Their design was crude by modern standards, but unmistakably functional, built for durability rather than ease of installation. Tracing the lines of these fixtures, he began to see the outline of a system rather than isolated components. The metal was arranged with purpose, aligned in a way that suggested load-bearing requirements and directional forces. This was not a random assembly, it had been engineered. His gaze followed a length of corroded cable disappearing into a narrow channel cut into the stone. The channel led upward and inward, vanishing into darkness beyond the reach of his headlamp. The cable itself was thick, its strands fused together by rust, but its presence raised immediate questions. Cables carried power, or signal, or tension. They connected things. He shifted his stance and leaned closer, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. The cable emerged from a sealed opening, its edges packed with a substance that might once have been rubber or fabric, now hardened and cracked by age. The seal had been meant to keep something out, or something in. A realization that this was not an exposed structure, but part of something enclosed, sent a ripple of unease through him. Whatever lay beyond this point had been hidden deliberately, protected from the elements and from casual discovery. The mountain had not simply swallowed it, it had been invited to cover it. He adjusted his headlamp and directed the beam deeper into the channel. The light revealed more worked stone, smoother and more regular than the surrounding rock. The passage widened slightly, enough to suggest an entrance rather than a crack. A thin rim of metal framed the opening, its surface scored with scratches that looked less like damage and more like wear. Someone had passed through here, repeatedly. The thought settled heavily. This was no single, desperate act of construction carried out in extremis. It was part of a routine, however extraordinary that routine might have been. Supplies had been brought here, equipment had been installed and maintained. A human presence had been sustained in a place that defied comfort and logic. He followed the frame of the opening with his gloved fingers, noting the thickness of the metal, the way it had been set flush with the stone. Hinges were visible on one side, fused by corrosion but still identifiable. On the opposite side, a remnant of a latch protruded, bent but intact. A door had once sealed this opening. He felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of anticipation and caution. Entering an enclosed space at altitude carried its own risks: air quality, structural stability, unknown hazards that could not be mitigated by climbing skill alone. He paused, forcing himself to slow down, to consider what he was about to do. The rational part of his mind cataloged the dangers. Old structures could collapse without warning. There could be pockets of stale air, accumulations of gases, sharp metal edges hidden in the dark. If he were injured here, rescue would be complicated at best, impossible at worst. At the same time, he understood that turning back now would leave too many questions unanswered. The mountain had already revealed more than he had expected, and the coherence of what he had found suggested that whatever lay inside would not be trivial. This was not a curiosity. It was a sight. He checked his equipment again, verifying that his harness was secure, that his headlamp had sufficient battery life, that his backup light was accessible. He adjusted his rope to ensure he could retreat quickly if necessary, anchoring it in a position that would not interfere with entry or exit. Before opening the door, he took a moment to observe the orientation of the alcove and the fixtures around it. His eyes traced an imaginary line from the cable channel outward, projecting where it might lead beyond the rock. The alignment pointed toward the valley, consistent with the metal glint he had first noticed from below. Whatever this installation was, it had been designed to look outward, not inward. That suggested communication rather than storage, observation rather than concealment. He placed his hand on the corroded edge of the door and applied gentle pressure. It did not move. He increased the force slightly, mindful of how brittle old metal could become. With a faint groan, the door shifted inward a fraction of an inch, releasing a puff of dry, stale air that carried no obvious odor but felt distinctly colder against his face. He froze, listening. There was no sound from within, no shifting or settling of material, no indication that the structure was about to fail. Encouraged, he widened the opening just enough to slip his headlamp beam inside. The light cut into darkness that seemed almost solid, revealing a narrow interior space carved directly into the mountain. The walls were close, the ceiling low, but the surfaces were unmistakably shaped by tools rather than erosion. The beam caught on metal edges, on surfaces that reflected light dully, on shapes that resolved slowly into recognizable forms. He opened the door fully and stepped inside. The transition was immediate and profound. Outside, the mountain had been a place of motion and sound, of wind and shifting balance. Inside, the air was still, heavy with age. The silence was complete, broken only by the faint hum of blood in his ears and the soft click of his headlamp adjusting its output. He stood in the threshold for several seconds, allowing his senses to recalibrate. The temperature inside was significantly lower than outside, preserved by the mass of the surrounding rock. His breath fogged briefly in the beam of his light before dissipating. The space was smaller than he had expected, but more complex. It was not a simple cavity, but a constructed interior, with deliberate divisions and fixtures that suggested extended use. The floor was flat and worn, the stone polished smooth by countless footsteps. The walls bore marks where equipment had been mounted and removed, leaving behind scars that spoke of change over time. He took a cautious step forward, careful to avoid disturbing anything unnecessarily. His boot contacted the floor with a muted sound that seemed too loud in the enclosed space. He paused again, listening, then continued. As he advanced, the interior revealed itself more fully. There were brackets along one wall, their shapes unmistakable now, designed to hold heavy apparatus. On the opposite side, shallow shelves had been carved directly into the stone, their edges worn smooth. A narrow conduit ran along the ceiling, carrying the same thick cable he had seen outside deeper into the space. The realization crystallized with quiet certainty. This was not merely an object embedded in the mountain. It was a room. And whatever purpose it had served, it had been important enough to justify carving a shelter into a sheer cliff face, hauling metal and equipment to a place that resisted every attempt at access, and maintaining it in conditions that bordered on unlivable. He advanced another step, his headlamp beam sweeping the interior in slow arcs. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadow, something else took shape. Something that anchored all the scattered details into a single, unmistakable conclusion. There was more here. Much more. The alcove, the metal fixtures, the cable, the door had all been preludes. He had not yet reached the heart of the installation. That lay deeper within the mountain, waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of casual light, preserved by stone and silence. As he moved forward, drawn by equal parts curiosity and responsibility, the sense of isolation that had defined his ascent shifted into something heavier. He was no longer alone with the mountain. He was stepping into the remnants of someone else's presence, a presence that had endured here long after the world below had moved on. And with that understanding came the quiet certainty that what he was about to find would not allow him to simply climb away and forget. The beam of his headlamp advanced slowly into the interior, pushing back the darkness a few feet at a time, revealing shapes that resolved not suddenly, but with a reluctant gradualness, as though the mountain itself resisted being observed. The space beyond the threshold narrowed at first, forcing him to angle his shoulders and move sideways, then widened again into a chamber no larger than a modest room, yet dense with presence. The air felt different here, not merely colder, but heavy in a way that had nothing to do with humidity or pressure. It carried the unmistakable sensation of enclosure, of having been sealed away from the rhythms of the outside world for a very long time. The silence was complete. Outside, even in moments of relative calm, there had always been wind, the distant rattle of loose stone, the faint whistle of air moving across irregular surfaces. Here, there was nothing. Sound seemed to be absorbed by the rock, swallowed before it could echo. The stillness pressed against his ears until he became acutely aware of his own breathing, the subtle creak of his harness when he shifted his weight, the muted thud of his boots on the stone floor. He stood still for several seconds, allowing his eyes to adjust to the confined space. The headlamp illuminated a tight cone, leaving the corners of the chamber submerged in shadow. As his vision adapted, the room revealed itself in fragments. The walls were unmistakably worked, their surfaces bearing the parallel scars of hand tools. Pick marks overlapped and crossed one another, some deeper than others, suggesting multiple passes, adjustments made over time. This was not a hastily carved refuge. It had been shaped with intention, refined until it served its purpose. The ceiling was low enough that he had to duck slightly, its curve reinforced by a rib of darker stone left intact, perhaps deliberately, to prevent collapse. Along one wall ran a series of metal brackets bolted directly into the rock. They were thick and heavy, designed to support weight, and though rusted, they remained firmly anchored. The pattern of their placement suggested equipment that had once been mounted here, removed only when it was no longer useful or when whoever had occupied the space left in a hurry. He moved further inside, careful with each step. The floor was smooth, worn flat by repeated use, and bore none of the loose gravel or debris common in natural caves. Whatever dust had once settled here had long since compacted into the stone itself. Near the center of the room, the beam of his light caught on metal once again, this time in a more complex arrangement. A rectangular frame rose from the floor, its edges corroded but intact, supporting a dense assembly of dials, switches, and panels. He recognized it immediately. The radio console stood against the far wall, its silhouette unmistakable even beneath layers of rust and mineral buildup. The casing was thick, industrial, built to withstand harsh conditions rather than elegance or comfort. Knobs protruded at uneven intervals, some frozen in place, others loose enough to turn slightly under gloved fingers. Glass faces on the dials were clouded but not shattered, their markings faintly visible beneath decades of grime. This was no civilian device. Everything about it spoke of military origin. The layout was utilitarian, stripped of ornament, designed for clarity and function. Labels were stamped directly into metal plates rather than printed, ensuring they would not fade or peel. Where wiring was visible, it was thick and carefully routed, secured with clamps rather than left to dangle freely. A cable ran from the back of the console up the wall and into the conduit he had seen earlier, leading outward toward the antenna. Another disappeared into the floor, likely connecting to a power source that no longer existed. He followed it with his eyes, noting the absence of modern materials. There was no plastic insulation, no synthetic sheathing. Everything here belonged to an earlier era. His light shifted, revealing a narrow bench set against the opposite wall. It was little more than a slab of stone with a wooden plank bolted across it, but it bore the unmistakable signs of use. The wood was polished smooth in places, darkened by oils from human contact. At one end of the bench lay a small collection of objects that brought a sudden, unexpected intimacy to the space. A dented metal cup rested on its side, its rim worn thin. Beside it lay a small tin, once sealed, now rusted open. Inside were fragments of something that might once have been food, now reduced to a dry, unrecognizable residue. A folded scrap of cloth lay nearby, stiff with age, its original color impossible to determine. He felt a tightening in his throat. These were not artifacts arranged for display or abandoned in chaos. They had been placed deliberately, used repeatedly, returned to the same spot day after day. This room had not merely been occupied, it had been lived in. His headlamp beam moved again, slower now, as if he feared what it might reveal next. Near the radio console, partially obscured by shadow, was a shape that did not belong to stone or metal. He adjusted the angle of the light, and the shape resolved into bone. The skeleton sat slumped against the wall, its position eerily composed. The spine leaned back slightly, supported by the rock, while the legs extended forward, bent at the knees. The skull rested at an angle that suggested the head had once been upright, perhaps tilted toward the radio, as if listening. The arms lay close to the body, one hand near the console, fingers curled inward. There was no sign of struggle, no scattered remains, no indication that the occupant had thrashed or fallen. The body had not been moved after death. It had simply remained where it came to rest. Clothing still clung to the bones in places, reduced to brittle fragments. A heavy jacket, its fabric long since stiffened, hung loosely from the shoulders. Metal buttons remained, dulled but intact, their design simple and functional. The remnants of trousers and boots completed the outline of a person who had once been very real, very alive, and very alone in this place. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he remained where he was, allowing the weight of the discovery to settle. Years of experience in rescue and recovery had taught him the importance of distance in moments like this. Respect demanded patience. This was not merely a find. It was a death scene, preserved by circumstance rather than intention. As he stood there, the implications began to assemble themselves with quiet inevitability. The presence of the radio station, the military construction, the location carved into an otherwise inaccessible cliff face, and now the remains of its operator all pointed to a single conclusion. This had been a functioning post, maintained under extreme conditions and abandoned only when abandonment was no longer possible. He stepped closer at last, his movements slow and deliberate. He examined the skeleton without touching it, noting details that spoke volumes without a single word. There were no weapons visible, no sign of defensive posture or violence. Whatever had ended this life had done so gradually. Near the skeleton's feet lay a small stack of papers, their edges curled and darkened. They were held together by a rusted clip, the metal having bled into the paper over time. He did not disturb them yet, but the faint grid lines and handwritten marks visible even from a distance suggested logs or records. The radio console itself bore signs of repeated use. Certain knobs were more worn than others, their surfaces polished by countless adjustments. One switch was fixed in a downward position, its surrounding metal scratched, as if it had been flipped repeatedly, perhaps in moments of urgency or frustration. The room contained no luxury, no comfort beyond what was strictly necessary. There was no bed, no chair, no attempt to soften the harshness of the environment. Whoever had been stationed here had not been meant to stay long, yet the evidence suggested that he had stayed far longer than planned. He felt a growing sense of unease, not born of fear, but of responsibility. Discoveries like this were not meant to remain private. They demanded acknowledgement, context, and care. To walk away without understanding what had happened here would be to erase a life a second time. At the same time, he was acutely aware of his vulnerability. He was alone, deep inside a structure embedded in a cliff face at altitude, with limited daylight and no immediate support. He needed to balance his instinct to investigate with the practical realities of survival. He took a step back and scanned the room once more, this time with a more analytical eye. He noted the lack of significant structural damage. The ceiling showed no major cracks. The walls were solid. Whatever fate had befallen the occupant, it had not involved a collapse or sudden catastrophe. This was important. It meant that the room itself was stable, at least for now. His headlamp flickered briefly as he adjusted its angle, and for a moment the shadows seemed to shift, giving the illusion of movement where there was none. He steadied himself, grounding his thoughts in the tangible details around him. Stone, metal, bone, all subject to time, all telling a story that had waited decades to be heard. He turned his attention back to the skeleton, tracing the outline of the jacket, the boots, the posture. The position suggested that the man had not been attempting to flee. He had not been crawling toward the door or reaching for something beyond his grasp. He had remained at his station. The realization carried weight. Whatever this place had been, whatever its purpose, the person who occupied it had chosen to stay until the end. He understood now that this was only the beginning. The radio station was not merely an object or a curiosity. It was a fragment of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond this cliff face and into a world shaped by conflict, duty, and silence. Carefully, deliberately, he reached for his camera and began to document what he saw, knowing that each image might become a piece of evidence, a thread in a story that had been severed long ago. As he worked, the sense of isolation that had accompanied his ascent transformed into something heavier, more profound. He was no longer alone with the mountain. He was sharing space with the remnants of a life that had ended here, waiting, listening, and never leaving. And as the light of his headlamp traced the contours of the abandoned radio station, he understood with absolute clarity that whatever came next would bind him to this place, to this story, in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The longer he remained inside the chamber, the more the initial shock of discovery gave way to a quieter, more disciplined focus. Years of experience had taught him that moments like this required restraint as much as curiosity. The room was not a mystery to be unraveled hastily, but a record to be read carefully, line by line, detail by detail without imposing assumptions too early. Whatever story this place held had survived precisely because it had been left undisturbed. He intended to keep it that way. He began by documenting everything systematically. He adjusted his headlamp to a wider beam and took photographs from the doorway inward, capturing the spatial relationship between the entrance, the radio console, the bench, and the slumped remains against the wall. He moved slowly, mindful of shadows and angles, making sure to preserve a visual record that would allow others to reconstruct the space as accurately as possible. Each image was deliberate, framed to include context rather than isolate objects into meaningless fragments. He recorded the coordinates of the location and the approximate altitude, cross-referencing them with his map and GPS. The numbers reinforced what he already knew intuitively. This post was positioned with the surgical precision. From here, the operator would have had an unobstructed line of sight over a wide section of the valley below, a vantage point impossible to reach accidentally. The mountain had not merely been used, it had been selected. His attention returned to the radio console. Up close, its age was unmistakable. The metal casing bore stamped serial numbers and manufacturing plates, their lettering shallow but legible beneath layers of corrosion. He brushed away a thin film of mineral dust with the edge of his glove, careful not to apply pressure. The markings that emerged were spare and utilitarian, identifying the unit type, power requirements, and operating ranges. There were no modern symbols, no plastic elements, nothing that suggested post-war manufacture. He photographed the plates and wrote down the visible numbers in his notebook, already anticipating the moment when these details would be cross-checked against archives and production records. Even without that confirmation, the design alone placed the equipment firmly in the early to mid-1940s. The radio was heavy, overbuilt, designed to function in environments where failure was not an option. It had been meant for war. The wiring told the same story. Thick cables ran along the walls, secured by metal clamps rather than adhesive or molded channels. The insulation was cloth-based, stiff and frayed at the edges, impregnated long ago with compounds meant to resist moisture and heat. In places where the insulation had cracked, bare copper glinted dully beneath, oxidized but intact. This system had been maintained carefully, repaired when necessary, adapted rather than replaced. He followed the cables with his eyes to their termination points. One led outward to the antenna, confirming the purpose of the installation beyond any doubt. Another disappeared beneath a removable stone slab in the floor. He did not lift it, but the outline suggested a compartment that once housed batteries or another form of power storage. There was no generator present, no sign of fuel. Whatever had powered this station had been finite. On the bench near the skeleton, he examined the papers more closely, still without touching them directly. They were not loose scraps, but organized sheets, stacked neatly and clipped together. Faint grid lines divided the pages into columns, and handwritten entries filled them in careful, consistent script. Dates were visible, though some had faded beyond recognition. Others remained legible enough to suggest a sequence rather than isolated notes. He leaned closer, angling the light to reduce glare, and read what he could without disturbing the stack. The entries were sparse but methodical. Times, frequencies, signal strength, brief remarks about interference or weather conditions. This was a log, kept with professional discipline even as conditions deteriorated. The handwriting did not waver or grow erratic over time. If anything, it became more compact, as though conserving space and effort. The dates stopped abruptly. There was no dramatic final entry, no flourish or declaration. The last page ended mid-column, the remaining lines blank. It was not the record of a sudden catastrophe, but of a routine that simply ceased. The implication was unsettling in its ordinariness. The operator had not stopped because something extraordinary happened in that moment. He had stopped because he could not continue. He turned his attention to the personal items scattered nearby. The metal cup bore scratches and dents consistent with long-term use. The tin had once held rations, its contents carefully rationed down to the last fragments. He found no wrappers, no excess packaging. Everything that could be consumed had been consumed. Everything that could be reused had been reused. There were signs of attempted preservation. Pieces of cloth had been stuffed into gaps around the doorframe and ventilation channel, likely to reduce drafts. A thin layer of soot on the stone near the ceiling suggested that some form of low-flame heating or candlelight had been used sparingly. There was no evidence of a fire large enough to provide warmth for extended periods. Heat had been a luxury here, not a given. He studied the skeleton again, this time with a more analytical eye. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma. There were no fractures consistent with a fall or impact. The skull bore no marks of violence. The posture, unchanged over decades, suggested that death had come quietly, perhaps during rest or while seated at the console. The likely causes narrowed themselves without drama: prolonged exposure to cold, malnutrition, altitude-related illness, infection left untreated. Any one of these could have ended a life here. Combined, they formed an almost inevitable outcome once supply lines failed and relief never arrived. The uniform fragments offered further clues. The cut and material were military, but not ceremonial. This was working gear intended for harsh environments. The buttons were plain, unadorned, their insignia minimal. He noted the absence of rank markers. Either they had been removed, lost, or the operator's role had not required visible insignia in such isolation. Near the skeleton's chest, partially hidden beneath layers of fabric, he spotted a small metal disc attached to a corroded chain. He did not lift it, but he recognized its shape immediately. Identification. The kind meant to endure long after everything else had decayed. The presence of that disc tightened something in his chest. This man had not been anonymous to the system that sent him here. His identity had been recorded, cataloged, expected to be recovered if the worst happened. The fact that it had taken so long spoke not of neglect but of circumstances that had overwhelmed even the most carefully laid plans. He returned his focus to the broader context. This station had not existed in isolation. It had been part of a network, a chain of observation and communication points spread across terrain where conventional infrastructure could not reach. During the war, such posts had been critical, providing early warning, coordinating movements, maintaining situational awareness in regions where radios were the only reliable link between units. The location made sense now. High enough to avoid detection from below, sheltered from aerial observation by the cliff's geometry, yet positioned to transmit signals down into the valley with minimal obstruction. The effort required to establish and maintain this post would have been enormous, but the strategic advantage justified it. What troubled him most was not how the station had been built, but how it had been forgotten. Wars did not end cleanly, especially not in remote regions. Units moved, command structure shifted, priorities changed. Posts like this one could be rendered obsolete overnight by decisions made far away. Evacuation orders could be delayed, misrouted, or lost entirely. In the chaos of transition, a single isolated station could slip through the cracks, its existence reduced to a line item crossed off a list. He imagined the sequence without embellishment, supply runs becoming less frequent, signals growing weaker as equipment aged and batteries depleted, messages sent and received with increasing difficulty, then silence from the other end. No confirmation, no instructions, just static. The logs suggested persistence. Even as conditions worsened, transmissions continued. The operator had adjusted frequencies, altered schedules, compensated for interference. He had done his job as long as he physically could. The realization brought with it a heavy clarity. This man had not been waiting for rescue in the romantic sense. He had been maintaining a duty, bound by training and responsibility rather than hope. Leaving without orders would have meant abandoning the post, severing a link that others might still depend on. Staying meant endurance, measured not in heroics, but in quiet repetition. The mountain had preserved that choice with indifferent efficiency. He finished his documentation slowly, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. He resisted the urge to tidy or reposition objects, understanding that even small changes could distort interpretation later. When he finally stepped back toward the doorway, the room felt no less oppressive, but it felt understood. Standing at the threshold, he looked back one last time. The radio console, silent now, the logs, unfinished, the skeleton, still at its post. This was not a mystery in need of invention. It was a historical fact waiting for recognition. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him by its calmness, that he could not simply report this and walk away. The discovery carried obligations that extended beyond personal safety or professional curiosity. This station had remained active in a sense long after its signals had faded, its existence unresolved, its story incomplete. As he stepped back into the narrow passage leading out of the chamber, the cold air brushing his face, he understood that the next decision he made would determine whether this place remained a forgotten scar in the mountain or became something acknowledged, its purpose finally brought to light. The war that had built this station might have ended decades ago, but here, on this sheer cliff face, its final chapter had never been written. Leaving the chamber did not immediately loosen the weight it had placed on him. As he stepped back into the narrow passage and then out onto the carved alcove, the mountain reclaimed its voice. The wind returned in sudden, forceful bursts, tearing at his jacket and tugging at the rope where it lay anchored to the stone. The contrast was jarring. Moments ago, silence had been absolute, almost reverent. Now the world roared again, indifferent and impatient, yet something had shifted. The cliff face was no longer just a physical obstacle to be negotiated. It had become the outer wall of a story that demanded completion. He secured himself more firmly on the ledge and took several long breaths, letting the cold air sharpen his thoughts. From this vantage point, the valley spread out below, vast and deceptively calm. Roads traced thin lines through forests and fields, and clusters of buildings hinted at towns whose inhabitants went about their lives unaware of the quiet history sealed into the rock above them. The radio station had been built to watch this space, to listen and speak across it, and its perspective suddenly felt painfully clear. This post had not been placed randomly or for redundancy, it had mattered. The realization that the station had never been formally closed pressed on him with increasing force. Military installations were not abandoned lightly. Even in retreat, procedures existed, records were kept, responsibilities transferred. For a post like this to remain intact, occupied until the end, suggested a breakdown not of discipline, but of communication. The war had moved on, leaving one of its sentinels behind. He replayed the evidence in his mind, aligning each detail with the next until a coherent picture emerged. The logs had shown persistence rather than panic. The equipment bore signs of maintenance long after initial installation. The makeshift insulation and careful rationing of supplies spoke of adaptation rather than resignation. This had not been a man waiting to die. It had been a man waiting to be told what to do next. At some point, that message had simply never arrived. The reasons were not difficult to imagine. Command centers relocated. Frequencies changed. Units dissolved or merged as fronts shifted. In the chaos of a global conflict drawn to a close, isolated mountain posts would have been among the first to lose contact and the last to be accounted for. A single missed relay, a single clerical error could erase an entire station from active awareness. The cruelty of that possibility lay in its banality. There was no villain, no dramatic betrayal, just distance, weather, and the limits of technology conspiring to cut one man off from the world he was serving. He considered the decision the operator must have faced once signals from below faded into static. Leaving the post without orders would have meant abandoning the very purpose for which it had been built. If the station still functioned, even partially, it remained a potential lifeline. Walking away would sever it entirely. Staying meant hope, however faint, that contact might be restored. The logs suggested that hope endured longer than comfort. Transmission attempts continued even as conditions deteriorated. Frequencies were adjusted, schedules altered, notes added about interference and atmospheric distortion. The discipline did not break down. It narrowed, focusing on essentials. Standing on the ledge, the modern climber felt a deep, unspoken respect take root. He had spent much of his life making calculated decisions under pressure, weighing risk against outcome. He understood the logic of staying put when movement offered no guarantee of survival. The difference here was time. This had not been a single night or a storm-bound delay. This had been weeks, perhaps months, of sustained isolation. The mountain offered no mercy to those who lingered. Supplies would have dwindled quickly. Cold would have become a constant companion, creeping deeper into bones and joints with each passing day. At this altitude, even rest brought little relief. Sleep would have been shallow, broken by breathlessness and the ache of hunger. Yet the station remained orderly. The final image burned into his mind was not one of chaos, but of quiet persistence. The skeleton had been seated, not collapsed in desperation. The radio had been within reach. The log lay unfinished, not discarded. He shifted his weight and glanced again at the antenna, its corroded frame still pointing faithfully toward the valley. It had been adjusted and readjusted countless times, its orientation maintained despite wind and ice. That act alone required repeated effort, repeated exposure to the elements. It was a gesture of belief in connection, in the idea that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. The question that now confronted him was not academic. It was personal and immediate. What responsibility did he bear, having discovered this place? He could descend, report the coordinates, submit photographs, and let bureaucratic processes unfold at their own pace. That would be reasonable, defensible, and safe. But he knew how such things could vanish into files and delays. Remote sites complicated recovery efforts. Jurisdiction blurred between military, historical, and civil authorities. Months or years could pass before action was taken, if it was taken at all. Meanwhile, the station would remain exposed to the elements, its contents slowly degrading, its story once again at risk of being lost. He looked back toward the dark opening in the rock. Inside, the radio console sat silent, but not erased. The logs remained legible. The antenna, though battered, still stood. The post had never been formally relieved. In a strange and uncomfortable sense, it was still active, still waiting for closure. That thought crystallized into a decision. He would not remove anything yet. Disturbing the remains or artifacts without proper oversight would be wrong, regardless of intention. But there was something he could do that would not violate that boundary, something that aligned with the very purpose of the station itself. He could complete the act that had defined this place for decades. He could make contact. The idea was not romantic, it was practical. If the station had existed to transmit information outward, then the most fitting acknowledgement of its service would be to use it once more, even if only symbolically. To send a final signal from the same location, along the same line of sight, would mark the end of its duty in a way that paperwork alone could not. He began to assess the feasibility with the same methodical care he applied to any technical problem. His own equipment included a compact emergency transmitter, designed for use in search and rescue operations. It was powerful enough to reach receivers in the valley under the right conditions. The antenna outside, though old, might still serve as an effective radiator if properly connected. The challenge lay in minimizing risk. Old structures could not tolerate sudden force or careless manipulation. Any attempt to interface modern equipment with decades-old hardware would have to be gentle, reversible, and limited in scope. He would not attempt to power the original radio or alter its configuration. Instead, he would use the antenna itself, if possible, as a passive element. He examined the cable routing again, tracing it from the antenna mount into the station. The insulation was brittle, but the core appeared intact. If he could establish a clean contact point without stressing the line, he might be able to connect his transmitter externally, avoiding disturbance of the interior altogether. The wind surged again, reminding him that time remained a factor. Clouds were beginning to gather along the distant ridgeline, thin and high, but indicative of a shift in conditions. He could not linger indefinitely. Whatever he chose to do would have to be done deliberately and efficiently. He secured his position and began preparing his equipment, moving with the same calm precision that had guided him up the wall. As he worked, he felt the strange convergence of past and present settle around him. The mountain had brought him here not by chance, but by the accumulation of decisions made long before his own. The station had waited, silent but intact, until someone capable of understanding it arrived. He paused briefly, looking once more at the valley below. Somewhere down there, signals once received from this post had been logged, acted upon, and then forgotten. Today, that silence might be broken, not to relay warnings or coordinates, but to acknowledge endurance. The post that had never been relieved would finally be recognized. And in completing that act, he knew he would bind himself to this place in a way that no climb ever had before. The wind had eased just enough to make the work possible, though not comfortable. It no longer struck the cliff face in violent, body-shaking gusts, but it still moved constantly, sliding along the rock like a restless presence, probing for weakness. The climber felt it tug at his sleeves and whisper past his helmet as he secured himself more firmly on the ledge. Every action from this point forward had to be controlled, deliberate, and quiet. Not because silence itself mattered, but because haste had no place here. He took a moment to steady himself, both physically and mentally. The decision had already been made in his mind, but carrying it out required discipline. This was not an emotional gesture, not an impulsive act meant to dramatize a discovery. It was a continuation of a function that had been interrupted decades earlier. If he was going to do this, it had to be done correctly. He removed his pack and laid it carefully against the stone, anchoring it so that it could not shift or slide. From within, he retrieved his compact emergency transmitter, a modern device designed for clarity and reliability rather than power. It was encased in a matte, impact-resistant shell, its controls minimal and intuitive. He checked the battery level, then checked it again, unwilling to leave anything to assumption. Cold could drain power faster than expected at this altitude, and he had only one opportunity to do this properly. Before touching the old installation, he examined it once more with a critical eye. The antenna's mounting brackets were heavily corroded, but the structure remained sound. The main mast was fixed directly into the rock, reinforced by metal plates that had been driven deep and secured with bolts thicker than his fingers. It had been built to withstand decades of exposure, and in that it had succeeded. The cable leading from the antenna disappeared into the stone through a narrow conduit. Its outer insulation was cracked and stiff, but the core showed no obvious breaks. He traced it gently with his gloved hand, feeling for weaknesses, for points where pressure might cause it to crumble. He applied no force, only observation. The last thing he wanted was to damage the very thing he hoped to use. He decided against entering the station again. Whatever connection he made would be external. The interior had been preserved too long, and disturbing it further was unnecessary. Instead, he focused on a section of cable just outside the conduit, where the insulation could be carefully separated without affecting the internal system. He worked slowly, using a small multi-tool to expose a minimal section of conductor. The metal beneath was darkened but intact. He cleaned it gently, scraping away oxidation until a dull sheen appeared. The act felt intimate, almost intrusive, but he reminded himself that this cable had once been adjusted, repaired, and handled countless times by the man inside. This was not violation. It was continuation. Once the contact point was prepared, he connected his transmitter using temporary leads designed for field improvisation. He ensured the connection was secure but easily reversible, testing it with a light touch. The antenna did not shift. The cable held. Satisfied, he stepped back slightly and took in the scene. From this narrow ledge, the world fell away in all directions. The valley below lay bathed in pale light, the afternoon sun filtering through high clouds that softened its edges. Roads, rivers, and settlements formed patterns too small to resolve clearly from this height. Somewhere down there, receivers might still exist. Modern ones, certainly, but perhaps also stations that monitored emergency frequencies, listening for signals that cut through the noise. He adjusted the transmitter's settings, selecting a frequency with the best chance of propagation under current conditions. He did not aim for secrecy or complexity. This was not a wartime transmission. It was an announcement, plain and unambiguous. Before activating the device, he paused. The moment carried weight far beyond its technical simplicity. He was acutely aware that he stood at the intersection of two timelines. One ended here decades ago, in silence and cold. The other continued, shaped by technologies and assumptions that made such isolation seem almost impossible. Bridging them was not a matter of words, but of intent. He keyed the transmitter and initiated the signal. The device emitted a low, steady tone as it powered up, its internal circuits stabilizing. He watched the indicator lights, confirming output levels and signal integrity. The antenna remained still, its orientation unchanged, as if waiting. He transmitted. The message itself was brief, structured for clarity rather than drama. He identified the location, the nature of the site, and the purpose of the transmission. He stated that the post was discovered intact, that its function was understood, and that its service was acknowledged as complete. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He spoke as one professional addressing another across time. When he finished, he released the key and waited. There was no immediate response, nor had he expected one. This was not a conversation. It was a closure. Still, he monitored the receiver for several seconds, watching for any sign of acknowledgement, any flicker of return signal. The display remained steady, unremarkable. He transmitted once more, repeating the essential details to ensure redundancy. Again, he waited, listening to the faint hiss of background noise. Nothing changed. That was enough. He powered down the transmitter and disconnected it carefully, reversing each step with the same attention he had given to the setup. The cable was resealed as best he could, the exposed section protected against further weathering. He left no modern equipment behind, no trace of his presence beyond what had already been etched into the mountain by time. As he secured his pack and prepared to descend from the ledge, a subtle shift occurred within him. The tension that had accompanied him since entering the station eased, replaced by something quieter and heavier. He did not feel triumph or relief exactly. What he felt was completion. The station had been built to speak outward, to maintain a line that connected isolation to purpose. That line had been broken, not by choice, but by circumstance. In sending that final signal, he had not restored the past, but he had acknowledged it. He had confirmed that the waiting had not been meaningless. He took one last look at the antenna, at the dark opening in the rock that concealed the chamber within. The mountain gave no sign of recognition. It remained as it always had, massive and unmoved. But he knew that something had changed, if only in the realm of human meaning. The descent demanded his full attention. The ledge offered no room for distraction, and the route downward was no easier than the climb had been. He rechecked his anchors, adjusted his rope, and began the careful process of retreating along the face. Each movement was controlled, measured against gravity and fatigue. As he descended, the station disappeared from view, swallowed once again by the geometry of the cliff. From below, it would remain invisible, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. That felt appropriate. The purpose of what he had done was not to expose the station to the world, but to prepare it to be understood properly, in its own time and context. Hours later, as he reached a safer section of the wall where he could pause without risk, he allowed himself a longer breath. The physical exertion of the climb had been considerable, but the mental weight had been greater still. He understood now that discovery carried obligations that extended far beyond the moment of finding. The final signal had been sent. The post had been acknowledged. What remained was to ensure that the story did not end here, suspended on a cliff face between past and present. He needed to bring this knowledge down from the mountain, to place it in the hands of those who could act on it with authority and care. The war that had built the station was long over, but its echo had just been heard one last time. And now, with the mountain behind him and the valley waiting below, the responsibility shifted from action to accountability. The descent began as all descents did, with discipline reasserting itself over reflection. The ledge fell away beneath his boots, and the cliff reclaimed his full attention. Gravity was no longer an abstract force but a constant negotiation, a pressure that had to be answered with precision. He tested each anchor before committing to it, running the rope through his hands, listening to the faint, familiar sounds that told him whether the system would hold. The mountain did not care what he had found or what he had done. It demanded the same respect it always had. He moved downward in stages, pausing at predetermined points where the wall eased just enough to allow a moment of rest. The wind strengthened again as the afternoon wore on, rising and falling in uneven waves that tugged at his balance and rattled loose fragments of stone. Several times he waited, pressed close to the rock until a burst passed and the air steadied. Fatigue crept into his forearms and calves, a dull ache that reminded him how long the day had already been. He ignored it, not by force of will, but by routine, breaking the descent into manageable sequences and focusing on each one as it came. As the station vanished above him, hidden once more by shadow and angle, its presence did not fade. If anything, it grew heavier with distance. The silence inside the chamber, the patient order of the logs, the posture of the remains stayed with him, overlaying the immediate demands of the climb. He found himself glancing down toward the valley more often than necessary, tracing the lines of roads and ridges as though mapping, in his mind, the path this story would now have to travel. By the time he reached a section of the wall where the angle softened and the risk eased enough to allow a longer pause, the light had begun to change. The sun dipped toward the western ridgeline, stretching shadows across the valley floor and tinting the rock around him with warmer hues. He secured himself and drank from his bottle, the cold water cutting through the dryness in his throat. Only then did he allow himself to think beyond the mechanics of movement. The next steps were clear. The discovery could not remain an isolated report passed casually from one authority to another. It required documentation, verification, and careful coordination. The site was not merely historical, it was a human remains location, a military installation, and a hazardous environment all at once. Any action taken would need to respect all three realities. He reached a lower terrace where the rock offered enough space to stand upright without fear of slipping. From there, the signal from his satellite communicator strengthened, the device chiming softly as it established a stable link. He waited until the connection was solid before initiating contact. This was not a message to be rushed. He transmitted his report with the same clarity he had used on the ledge above. He gave coordinates, altitude, and access details. He described the installation in factual terms, avoiding speculation or emotional language. He noted the presence of human remains, the apparent age of the equipment, and the indicators that placed the site within the context of the Second World War. He emphasized the difficulty of access and the need for experienced high-angle teams should any recovery be attempted. The response, when it came, was measured but immediate. Questions followed, precise and practical. He answered them patiently, aware that each detail mattered. He provided images where requested, compressing and transmitting them despite the limited bandwidth. As the exchange continued, he could hear the shift on the other end of the line, the moment when curiosity gave way to recognition. This was no longer a hypothetical or a rumor. It was a verified site. He was asked to remain available, to preserve the location as best he could, and to avoid any further disturbance. That instruction aligned perfectly with his own instincts. He had no desire to return to the station until a proper plan was in place. The mountain had kept its secret long enough. It deserved to be approached with care now that it had been found. The descent continued in the fading light, the final sections less technical but no less demanding. Loose scree and fractured slabs replaced the sheer verticality of the upper wall, introducing a different kind of hazard. He moved deliberately, testing each step before trusting it, mindful that a misstep here could still result in serious injury. When he finally reached the base of the climb and stepped onto stable ground, the relief was physical and immediate. His legs trembled slightly as they adjusted to standing without constant tension. He did not linger. Night temperatures at this elevation dropped quickly, and he still had distance to cover before reaching his vehicle. He packed his gear with practiced efficiency and began the long hike out, his headlamp carving a narrow tunnel of light through the encroaching darkness. The stars emerged overhead, sharp and numerous, unblurred by city glow. The mountains around him stood silent and immense, their outlines barely visible against the sky. Hours later, when he reached the trailhead and stowed his equipment, exhaustion finally asserted itself. He sat on the tailgate of his truck for several minutes, letting the cold air wash over him, grounding himself in the ordinary details of the present. The smell of dust and metal, the weight of his boots, the faint ache in his shoulders. These were familiar sensations, anchors that kept him from drifting too far into the gravity of what he had found. The days that followed unfolded with a deliberate pace that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the climb. Calls were returned, reports expanded, and images analyzed by specialists who brought their own expertise to bear. Military historians confirmed the era of the equipment. Archival researchers began tracing unit deployments and communication networks that had operated in the region during the final years of the war. Each confirmation added another layer of solidity to the story, transforming it from an extraordinary find into an established fact. Plans for a recovery operation took shape slowly, constrained by weather forecasts, resource availability, and jurisdictional considerations. High-angle rescue teams were consulted, their assessments blunt and realistic. The approach would be complex and dangerous, requiring experienced climbers, redundant safety systems, and careful timing. No one suggested haste. The remains had waited decades. They could wait a little longer if it meant being handled properly. When the operation finally commenced, he was present not as a lead, but as a guide, someone who knew the route and the site intimately. The mountain greeted the team with the same indifference it had shown him, offering no favors. The climb was conducted with precision and restraint, each movement checked and rechecked. The station was reached without incident, and the chamber entered with a quiet respect that required no spoken instruction. The remains were documented in situ by specialists before any attempt at removal. Identification followed established protocols. The metal disc he had noticed was carefully examined, its markings preserved and recorded. Cross-referencing with archival data narrowed the possibilities until a name emerged, one that had been listed for decades as missing in action, presumed lost to the mountains without explanation. The confirmation carried a weight that was felt even by those trained to maintain professional distance. This was no longer an anonymous skeleton or an abstract example of wartime sacrifice. It was a specific person, with a history, a family, and a role that could now be described with clarity. The post he had manned was no longer a footnote. It was a testament. The evacuation itself was conducted with painstaking care. The remains were secured and transported along the same route the living man had once used, reversed now with the benefit of modern equipment and teamwork. Every step was controlled, every anchor placed with intention. The mountain did not yield easily, but it did not resist outright. When the team finally reached the valley floor, there was no sense of triumph, only completion. Formal recognition followed in due course. Military records were amended, reports were filed, the installation was officially cataloged, its purpose and history summarized without embellishment. The language used was precise and restrained, the kind reserved for matters of record rather than legend. It was enough. Throughout the process, the climber remained present but unobtrusive. He answered questions when asked, clarified details when needed, and otherwise allowed the institutions designed for such work to do their jobs. He felt no urge to claim ownership of the story. He had not created it. He had only encountered it. When the preparations for burial were announced, he was invited to attend. He accepted without hesitation, understanding that this, too, was part of the responsibility that came with discovery. The mountain had released its secret. Now it was the world's turn to respond appropriately. As he stood at the edge of the cleared site where the ceremony would take place, watching the final arrangements come together, he felt the arc of events settle into place. The descent from the cliff had not been an ending, but a transition. The true conclusion lay ahead, not in stone and silence, but in recognition and memory. The morning of the burial arrived without ceremony. There were no dramatic clouds, no unusual stillness in the air to signal that something out of the ordinary was about to take place. The sky was clear, pale blue, and the mountains stood as they always had, silent and immovable. That ordinariness felt appropriate. What was about to happen did not need spectacle. It needed correctness. The cemetery lay on the edge of the valley, bordered by low hills and a line of weathered trees that offered little shelter from the wind. Rows of headstones stretched across the grass in careful order, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and weather. Some marked recent losses, their stone still sharp-edged and clean. Others dated back generations, names and dates fading into near anonymity. This was a place where individual stories eventually blended into a larger, quieter narrative. The climber arrived early, parking at a respectful distance and approaching on foot. He wore simple, dark clothing, nothing that would draw attention. The leather journal of notes and printed reports that had accompanied him through the weeks of investigation remained in his truck. This moment was not about documentation. It was about presence. A small group had already gathered. Military representatives stood together near the open grave, their uniforms formal and precise. A folded flag rested on a stand nearby, its colors vivid against the muted tones of stone and earth. A chaplain spoke quietly with an officer, their voices low and indistinct. A few civilians stood apart, hands clasped, faces solemn. Among them were relatives of the fallen man, connected to him by blood rather than history, their expressions a mixture of grief and relief that needed no explanation. The climber recognized none of them personally, yet he felt bound to them all by the same invisible thread. Without that climb, without the decision to follow an impossible glint of metal on a cliff face, this gathering would not exist. The thought did not bring pride. It brought humility. When the casket arrived, carried by a small honor guard, conversation ceased entirely. The procession moved with deliberate slowness, each step synchronized, each motion practiced and exact. The remains inside had been prepared with care, the work of professionals who understood both the technical and symbolic weight of what they handled. The casket was simple, unadorned, its surface polished but not reflective. It did not demand attention, it accepted it. As the casket was lowered into position, the climber felt the quiet finality of the moment settle over the gathering. This was the point at which the story, so long suspended between discovery and acknowledgement, began to resolve. The man who had waited in silence for decades was no longer alone, no longer unseen. The chaplain spoke first, his words measured and restrained. He did not dwell on battle or ideology. He spoke instead of duty, of a service carried out without witnesses, of responsibility accepted without certainty of recognition. His voice carried across the small assembly, steady and clear, and the climber found himself listening not as an observer, but as someone addressed directly. When the military officer stepped forward, the tone shifted slightly, becoming more formal, more precise. The details of the recovered records were summarized succinctly. The location of the post, its function, the circumstances under which it had been abandoned. The officer made no attempt to soften the truth or embellish it. The facts alone were sufficient. They spoke of a station that had remained operational until its operator could no longer maintain it, of a line of communication that had been held open long after it had ceased to be acknowledged. At the conclusion of the statement, the honor guard took position. The air seemed to tighten as rifles were raised in unison. The climber felt the sharp crack of the first shot echo through the valley, followed by the second and the third. The sound rolled outward, rebounding faintly from the distant slopes before fading into silence. The salute was brief but absolute, a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had taken 80 years to complete. As the flag was folded and presented to the next of kin, the climber looked away, giving the family the privacy the moment deserved. He did not need to see their faces to understand what was passing between them. Relief and sorrow were not opposites here. They coexisted, inseparable. When the formalities concluded, the gathering lingered for a few minutes, uncertain of how to transition back into ordinary time. Conversations resumed quietly, subdued by the weight of what had just occurred. Some people drifted away almost immediately, as if leaving quickly was the only way to keep emotion in check. Others remained, standing in small clusters, sharing brief words that felt inadequate but necessary. The climber stood apart, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze fixed on the newly placed marker at the head of the grave. It bore the man's name, rank, and unit, along with dates that now had context rather than mystery. Below them, a simple line noted the circumstances of his death, careful in its phrasing, precise in its meaning. It did not speak of heroism directly. It did not need to. Later that day, after the cemetery had emptied and the valley returned to its quiet routines, the climber found himself alone on a rise overlooking the town. The mountains framed the horizon, their peaks sharp against the sky. Somewhere among them, hidden once more from casual view, the cliff face held the sealed chamber where the radio station remained. The site had been secured, its entrance stabilized, its presence recorded in official registries. No sign would mark it on the mountain itself. That, too, felt right. He reflected on how little the physical world had changed as a result of everything that had happened. The cliff still stood, the wind still moved along its face. Snow would come and go, rocks would fracture and fall, and the mountain would continue its slow, indifferent evolution. Yet something essential had shifted all the same. The station was no longer a forgotten anomaly. It was a documented place, a point in history with a defined beginning and a defined end. The man who had served there was no longer missing, no longer reduced to an unanswered question. His story had been restored to the human record where it belonged. In the weeks that followed, the climber returned to his routines, to work that required the same focus and caution that had guided him on the wall. Life resumed its familiar rhythms, yet the experience left a lasting imprint. He found himself more attentive to small irregularities, more willing to pause when something did not fit expectations. Not every anomaly would lead to such a discovery, he knew, but the habit of attention had proven its worth. Occasionally, inquiries came his way from historians or researchers seeking clarification on details of the site. He answered them as best he could, always careful to distinguish between what he had observed directly and what had been inferred later. Precision mattered. The story did not need speculation to remain compelling. Once, while reviewing a map for an unrelated project, his eyes drifted toward the range where the station had been found. He traced the contours absent-mindedly, noting how easily the cliff face blended into the surrounding terrain. From a distance, there was nothing remarkable about it at all. That anonymity had been its greatest protection and its greatest curse. He thought of the man who had climbed there under far more primitive conditions, hauling equipment and supplies upward with no guarantee of return. He thought of the long days spent maintaining the radio, adjusting the antenna, logging transmissions that might never be answered. He thought of the final weeks when silence from below would have grown harder to ignore, when the cold would have pressed in from every side. What struck him most was not the endurance itself, but the clarity of purpose that must have sustained it. The operator had not needed recognition to do his job. He had needed only the belief that the work mattered. That belief had carried him through isolation and hardship until his body could no longer follow. The climber understood then that the final signal he had sent from the ledge had not been for the world below alone. It had been for the man on the other end of history's broken line, a confirmation that the waiting had been seen and understood. The transmission had closed a circuit that had remained open for far too long. On a clear evening, months later, he found himself driving through the valley at dusk. The mountains loomed dark against the fading light, their outlines familiar yet newly charged with meaning. He pulled over briefly, stepped out of the vehicle, and looked up. Somewhere, high above, the cliff face was already swallowed by shadow, indistinguishable from the rock around it. The path forward was open now, not in a literal sense, but in the way unresolved things sometimes weigh on the mind. A story completed freed attention for the next challenge, the next climb, the next moment when awareness might make a difference. He returned to his truck and drove on, the road unspooling ahead of him, carrying him back into the flow of ordinary life. Behind him, the mountain kept its silence, but it was no longer the silence of neglect. It was the silence of something set in order, a debt paid, a duty acknowledged. The war had ended long ago, but one of its smallest, quietest chapters had finally been written to its proper close. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to see the next discoveries and true stories that time tried to hide. Watch the other videos on the channel. Each one reveals a forgotten place, a lost decision, or a human story buried where no one thought to look. And if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who appreciates real history and real courage.